Hi everyone, and welcome to part 2 of painting Eltharion, and today we're going to focus on painting this cloak. So this tutorial is going to focus all on how to paint cloaks. It's going to be just with the brush, and we're going to really focus on getting the dilution correct and learning a lot about layering. So I'm pretty much just using the layering technique with brush only. And I think you can get really far with layering. There's going to be a few bits of glazing at the end, but mostly it's just carefully layering, which I think is an important technique to master, and cloaks are something that come up so often. So this isn't really just about painting Eltharion, it's trying to help you paint cloaks. So let's dive into it. These are the paints I've decided to use for my blue. Nightlord's Blue is a really nice addition, I think, to the Citadel line. It's just a little bit darker and a little less saturated than Cantor Blue. I found myself adding a tiny bit of black to Cantor Blue quite often just to desaturate it. So actually, yeah, this is a really nice welcome addition and a perfect base. And being a Citadel base, it's really nice to apply and get a really smooth foundation, which is really important. Then the highlight colours, I've decided to use scale colours. They can be a little bit of a pain to work with. A lot of people say that. I personally like them. The reason I've chosen these is really their tone. When I was looking at the artwork that I really liked and kind of flicking through Photoshop, I think these are the closest match to that colour that I really liked. One thing that's nice about scale is they're really matte. And with my cloaks, that's something I like to do. Often I'll use ultra matte varnish on my cloth, and just using these paints means I don't need to do that. I was surprised myself that Berrying Blue is the colour I've gone for, but again, when I looked at that artwork reference, the highlights really aren't saturated at all. They're not like a vibrant blue. I tried with other blues, such as Lothan, and you can just see the difference. This is just more vibrant, and I wanted something a little softer, yeah, this is what I've decided to go for. I'm going to try it out on Eltharion. Maybe it won't be the exact colours I used for the army, but in my tests I was very happy with these three, and I was also happy that I kept it to just 3 paints, so that's reasonably simple, so I'm happy with that. One thing that's become clear when doing these tutorials, and just speaking to a lot of people, is often people are still confused about getting the dilution right. So in this tutorial, I want to kind of go over things a little more thoroughly, just to make sure you're happy. So this obviously is undiluted paint, and with the base coat, we really want strong coverage with the base coat, so we don't want it too thin because we want all of the properties from the paint. Especially with this Nightlord's Blue, which is a very, very desaturated dark blue. So if we water it down too much, then we're just not going to get any power from it. But I do want it to be as smooth as possible. So I'm just taking 1 brush load of water. Mix that in nicely. Try and use an old brush for mixing. And it was quite a big brush load, but you can see the level of translucency there. So it's a little bit translucent, but not as thin as perhaps some of the layers we'll do later. You'll be able to tell if you've got the dilution right from the first application on the model, and when I paint it on each time, we'll talk about that. So onto the base coat. Over a black primer, it's going to take a few coats. If you wanted a really vibrant blue, I'd probably recommend doing a lighter one, or a pre-highlight with the airbrush, you know, with the black and the white. I'm using a size 5 brush from Artisopus. So it's a good idea for the base coat to use the biggest one you feel comfortable with. I'd recommend a Winsor & Newton size 2, or an Artisopus 3 or 4 onwards, those sort of sizes. One thing though you've got to be wary of is how much water loads into these brushes. So when you're kind of washing it, it can hold so much water, and that can ruin your mix, and it can also make the paint just flow everywhere. So although I do like a large brush, you do have to be careful when using them. So I've got my paint diluted correctly, so I don't really need to have a lot of moisture on the brush. It's just wet, but then it's been turned into a point. And I'll load up the brush on the palette. And you can see I've not got loads of paint on there to start with. And that's so I can check the dilution is correct. So I'm going to push the bristles, flow nicely. And dilution seems okay, maybe a little thin. And what I'm going to do is just move quite long sweeping brush strokes, and I can move the paint a little bit around, but I'm trying not to fiddle with it too much. There's going to be parts where it's inconsistent, but I'm just going to return to those for a second pass when it's dry. To get a smooth base coat, I want a few coats, but once I put the paint down, I really just leave it alone. And you'll notice I'm trying not to let too much paint flood one area, and that's why I was sort of warning about using a large brush. So now I know it's right. You can see I've loaded the brush a little more, but it's nowhere near the ferrule. And this brush is big, but it does have a nice point. So I can be careful when coming into areas like this. I really like this colour, and it's looking really nice against the gold. I think bright blue and bright gold's a bit much, so that's why I'm aiming for a slightly duller blue. Now I will say I think my dilution is probably a little too much because we've got very translucent areas here. But we'll let it dry and give it a second coat and see how that goes. But with the base coat, you really, you can dilute it to a minimum, the least amount you can get away with to get it smooth. And that's so we get the colour out of it. And that's particularly true with a colour like this. It doesn't have much colour to it. So you can see I've covered pretty much all of the cloak now. There's some bits I've missed, and it's really patchy and watery, so the temptation is to move the paint around or add more, but we have to let this dry in order to get a nice clean finish and a nice result. So I would recommend hair drying it. I'm just going to leave it for a little while, and we'll come back to that dry. So that's it fully dry, and you can see if you look closely, we haven't got even coverage. We've got like patchy places. And that's one of the really important things to getting a smooth paint job, is that you apply the paint, let it dry, and then just go over it again until you get it nice and opaque. If you keep building up the layers and it's patchy every time, then you don't get any strong colours and it doesn't look smooth, and it's also hard to go back to a previous layer to correct things because you haven't got that full opacity on the paint. So what we're going to do is apply a second coat, and then we'll see how that looks then. So same as before, paying attention to how I'm moving the brush, how much I've loaded the brush, and we're not going to give the patchy areas any sort of special attention really. We just do a layer over the top, and we paint the whole thing. We're just trying to get everything clean and smooth. So you can see I'm working a little bit quicker now. And I'm trying to almost cover the whole thing before it's dry. So if I sort of paint along a line here where I have a wet patch and a dry patch, my brush can move over both of them to kind of link them together, but I've got to do that before it's started to dry. Back to the palette, and we've got the Night Lord's blue here, and we're going to take good old wallop of this Canterbrick blue and mix that in. just create a nice increment between the two. And you can leave that blob there just to make a comparison. And I've got a big brush here, my size 5, so I'm just careful with how much water I load in it, because you can easily load way too much. And just dilute it a little bit, carefully at time. Probably a touch more, as we're going to go more diluted now for our layers. You can see that sort of dilution. So I really like the Night Lord's blue. It's really dark, quite desaturated. It's what I was looking for. It's very, very satin though. You can see how shiny it is, but that does tell you where the highlights need to go. Really importantly, look about how these really fine lines in the recess, these are highlights as well as the peaks. So we'll paint these later and you'll see what I mean, but this just kind of proves that this is where the highlights need to go. That's why I don't think using a wash technique is necessarily the best way to approach a cloak, because the wash will fall into these recesses and it will make them dark, but actually this is where the light needs to go. You might notice as well, it might not be too visible, there's a couple of patches where it's extra glossy, and that's where the brush was loaded with too much paint and it's kind of flooded the area, and it's just all the resin from the paint has dried and gone extra shiny. So that's why you've got to be careful about applying not too much paint. But now we've got that mix loaded up, we're going to start layering. I've switched to a smaller size 3, making sure I'm not going to have too much paint loaded on the brush at a time. And I'm going to be quite cautious and careful. When you're more confident, you can move faster. But I just want to take my time with this cloak because I want it to be right. Now these are going to be very large highlights. This Night Lord's blue is pretty much the shadow. And what we're going to start working on now is the mid-tone, the main colour. And you can see where the light's catching this area, a very broad highlight that we want to paint. And this will also come from here, and these will link together. And we'll be very careful in getting the right size shadow here. So, even though this is a 3, it's got a nice fine point, and I can get the brush in that recess. And then onto the one above. Now when you have a cloak shaped like this, the obvious brush stroke is going to be coming down like that. The problem with this is you can form very strong lines, and that's where it gets really, really streaky. There's a couple other brush strokes you can try. One is a side-to-side movement, which would be something like this. And that won't form those really strong lines. The problem with that is it's not as perfect, not as precise, and it's difficult to do unless it's a large open area. The other type of thing you can do is move the pigment up like that. And this will push the strongest light in the center where we want it. The negative to that is sometimes you can get a jagged line unless you move your brushstroke perfectly, and again that's quite time consuming. Really, it's a combination of these strokes. We can do the straight down one if our paint is reasonably diluted, because that means we won't be forming particularly strong lines. Or what we can do is kind of just combine all those different brush strokes and try and get a smooth layer. Also, later we'll show you using glazes to get rid of any of those lines. But these are all the little tiny things that really add up to getting a smooth paint job, and I think that's probably one of the most common questions I keep getting asked of late, how to get stuff smooth. Now that's dry. I really like this colour. I really like the mix of the two, and it's kind of the perfect mid-tone. You can see how dark the Night Lords is now. It kind of almost looks black. Now we've got something lighter to compare it to, but I think it's important to have it for the shadows. But yeah, this is definitely like the kind of mid-tone or first mid-tone. You can see, if I try and catch it in the light, where this isn't perfect. And it's the same with the base coats, really. You just have to do that first application and then build it up until you get it smooth and opaque for every layer. And it's quite time consuming, but ultimately it's worth it. And this is where I might use some different types of brush stroke, like I said. So where it's not perfect along this fold, I'll carefully move the paint upwards, just where I need it to be. And then I change my stroke up the top because I need to use the point and be more accurate. And make sure these all link into each other. I also really like how matte this blue is, and it really allows me to kind of see where I'm going. Honestly, I can't see sometimes with these glossy paints, so this is helpful. So because we've just done a small increment, the coverage was pretty much there. So this second coat is actually more like tidying up. I'm going to cover probably all the parts anyway because it doesn't take long. But yeah, this is just getting it a little cleaner. This part here, it has a little dip in it, but at this stage, I think it should be all this colour. Really, the base coat of Night Lords, the really dark shadow, that's going to be reserved for sort of right down there. You could actually base coat with this colour and then quite easily shade it with the Night Lords blue. It's all about how you prefer to work, really. So it took me a long time, but just continuing with that technique, layering nice and diluted, you can see I've got a very even and nice finish. And basically we've got a nice matte look as well. It can look a little strange when you mix brands because the Citadel base is slightly more satin. So as we turn it, we get a little bit of shine off of the shadows there. We can always matte varnish at the end to bring it together if that's something we don't like. But this stage I find takes the longest because we've got to cover a very large area. You can see I've almost just left small shadows, just in the extremes really. And they're really important to have those shadows, but the mid-tone just covers so much. But it's worth kind of taking your time on this because if we have that really opaque, really smooth, when we build the highlights on top of it, it's just so much easier and we get a nice result. So what I think is when you get to this phase, it's going to be a lot easier. It's going to be quicker and it will start to look great. But already we have this really smooth matte start to the cloak and it looks so nice against the metallics. So what we're going to do is start highlighting, and we're going to use some of the Canterbrick blue on its own, and then we're also going to add in some of the Beryllium blue, and we'll just gradually add that in until we feel we've got adequate contrast. So the dilution's pretty much going to be the same for all these layers, so it'll be the same kind of dilution as the previous one. If it's not going on smooth enough, just add some more water. So we're going to just move slightly further in each time. Every increment's going to be a little bit narrower. So this highlight, instead of covering all the way across, now we can start to separate these two folds. They'll link together at the top, but then I'll actually get that slight separation on those two now. And most of these will actually meet at the beginning here at this top part. But then we need to pick out all the individual volume. What I like to do is start a little bit too narrow, so you can see the width of the highlight there. I might go back and do a second layer and broaden it if I need to. And then I'm just doing quite a thin highlight in that recess. So I'm just moving to the point of the brush there. On the larger parts, all we do is use the side of the brush and compress the bristles more. So you can see here I was on the tip, and then on this part I just push a little more on the bristles. And that'll gain access to more of the brush. And I'll quickly come in and add that to that there. That's good, that's good. I'm going to save that recess for a little bit of a brighter colour later. Don't really need to layer up the recesses, they're so thin. I'll just get one coat in there later with a brighter colour. I'd like to pretend that my palette was really nice and neat, but it's not. Looks like this, but I've actually been experimenting with a few other blues. So I'm just going to take a small amount of the bearing blue and add it into here. Judge it by eye, and I need to add a little more water. You need to keep checking the dilution as we go brighter. Add some more. We'll try that out, see the dilution. So it might be thicker than some of you think, if you have a look at this sort of dilution. This is not a glaze, this is a layer. It's reasonably diluted, and there's basically, you know, different translucencies of layers, so you can have a thick layer, a thin layer. But by definition, I wouldn't really call this a glaze just yet. But yeah, you need to adjust the dilutional layers depending on the properties of the paint. So blue has great coverage, so we can dilute that a reasonable amount. But other colours, you know, are more translucent naturally, and so you don't. So there's not really a one size fits all with dilution. All you need to do is a few brush strokes on the model, and then you should be able to tell whether you're going to get a nice transition or not. Essentially, this is going to be a lot of repetition now, but we'll do some faster video clips, and you can just see it get built up. So I'm just starting with the important parts here. I'm going to let that dry and check that that colour's okay. Yeah, it looks okay. And I'm still using a 3, but you could move down to a smaller brush if you're more comfortable. I start off with the kind of the detail painting, which are the small little recesses, and then I'll move to the big areas after. This bit at the top is nice and detailed. And this is why I'm paying careful attention to paint the exact right width of highlight. So I'll start a little small on the big one here, and I'll probably make that a bit bigger later. Sorry if it goes out of focus sometimes. I think it grabs my brush and sticks to that. But this is looking pretty good. I'm actually going to repeat that off camera. I'll let it dry, and I'll just make sure that this layer is opaque, and then I'll start adding a little bit of a lighter colour, I think. So that step's looking nice and opaque, so I can add some more of the lighter blue in. I'm not showing you everything I add to the palette, because you actually need to, one, kind of adjust to your style. So some people might want to use more increments than others, depending on your brush stroke skill and also how perfect you want it to be. And you also need to get to grips with, you know, how to do that, and that only comes from experimentation, really. I'm trying to take you through a lot of the minor details, like little things like the brush stroke and dilution, but creating the increments you definitely need to find for yourself. And it's pretty obvious because when you layer it on, if it's too much of a jump, you can just see that. So, starting to get pretty narrow now. Much skinnier highlights. And I love this phase because it's fast, just small areas, and this is where we start to get the contrast. And it starts to look really cool. So I'm trying to be really accurate now as we get into these later steps. I'm on the point of the brush way more. There's a lot of little creases in here. Maybe for the last step I'll need to switch to a smaller brush. Doing a second layer here in the same spot. So I'm guessing probably going to have one or two more steps. Not far off. So you can see I'm kind of doing 2 coats for every highlight, but now we're doing these smaller areas. Actually doesn't take too much time. This is a fairly labor intensive way of doing the cloaks. You can paint big areas of highlight and glaze the colour in, but I kind of like this way. It's therapeutic, and I can almost guarantee a good result because I can just take my time with it. I'm going to use glazes to blend this even smoother, and you can use that same technique and skip a few steps if you want. Okay, so I'll let that dry, and we need to go brighter again. I think just one more time, maybe 2, nearly there. So for the final highlight, I'm going to switch to my little detail brush, and the point is really good on the brush I was using, but I like the smaller brush. This is a 2-0 because the bristles move less, and it just means I can be a little more accurate. And I need to kind of grab the model, I'm afraid, so it's nice and sturdy. And now I'm making sure there's hardly any paint on my brush and making sure my head doesn't get in the shot, but I really want to be close so I can see. And now we just do the last little skinny lines, and we're trying to really bring out the detail now. And this is where we'll really get in these recesses, which is tricky. But it starts to look awesome. I really like this colour. It was a good choice. It's a really different tone to the base blues. The base blues are kind of your run-of-the-mill, quite saturated blues, but this berrying blue is it's very desaturated greyish blue. So it just looks nice as we shift into it. It gives a really nice final highlight colour. This isn't pure berrying blue yet, it's still got a little bit of the previous one. So I could go further, but I'm thinking that this is enough. I think I'll probably glaze everything back down, and that might give me a different opinion of the highlights. If it needs a brighter one after glazing, then we can do that. So you can see I'm just doing real skinny lights. And I'm not necessarily going the whole way down now. I actually want to start drawing more light around here. So we've kind of got all the highlights across there, but it looks better if you draw the eye to one particular area. So we have obviously the variety across all the folds, but then from there to there as well. So, and because this is more detailed at the top, it makes more sense. I really like how this has ended up, both in the volumes of the highlights and also the tone. It's a nice blue, but it's not too vibrant. That's what I was finding difficult to find. I think the key was the berrying blue, and I often have a bad habit of pushing things too bright, especially on like cloaks, and it can end up looking a bit metallic. So I think it was nice because it kind of reined it back for me. You know, I still feel like pushing the highlights, but they're probably adequate, and it still feels like cloth, but I think it still looks nice. So all there's to do now is really do some corrections, do some blending. And like I said, the limitation of layering like this is you do get lines. It's nice and accurate, and you can get the nice perfect widths, and this is a pretty good result. Actually, this is for my gaming army, so you know I could just leave it here, but I want to show you how to get things perfect, and yeah, let's face it, I want to do it. So what we're going to do is the glaze technique, and I'm going to start off with the Canterbrick blue, and then we might use the Night Lord's blue too. But basically anywhere where you're not happy with a transition, you can take that nice diluted paint and just work over the area where you're not happy with the blend. The thing about glazing is you won't need to do it on every area, and some will need just 1 or 2 glazes and others will need a lot. So this is a part I haven't blended very well. Look, you can see that really strong line. So what I'm going to do is take the blue, I'm going to move over this line into the shadow, and I'm trying to erase it. You can't work miracles with glazes, just consider them as slight adjusters. When you haven't got it quite spot on, you can just tweak it. If I do something and I can't fix it with a glaze, then you basically have to go to thick paint. Try and find the right tone, and hopefully you've still got it mixed on your palette, and yeah, almost just erase it, sort of go over the top of it, try and get rid of it. This area, because it's got all the little tight highlights, it's kind of covered up the mistake, so it's really the bottom area where it's more open. So I'm just going to keep going and try and blur some of these lines. It's quite a bad one there. And trying to always move into the dark parts, because most of the time you're going to be glazing with a darker colour. That I tend to find is easier. So layer up with lighter colours and then glaze with a dark colour. I tend to move around and just find all the parts that need fixing. And then by the time I've gone round, normally an area like this, that line is slightly less visible. So we go over it again, but it was nice and dry. You should be putting hardly any paint down. It's just a film, you can see, just a little bit, and that means it should dry really quickly. If it's not drying fast, then give it a hair dry, but you're probably loading your brush with too much. I tend to use a small brush for this, and that's because I can't load hardly any paint, and I just get that control. But I've done quite a good job of layering here. So really I'm just correcting the really bad parts. If it looks okay, then it's fine, but this isn't fantastic, so I will make the effort on that. The good thing about glazing though is you can come back to it at any point. So I could stop my session now with it unblended and just make corrections. Sometimes you come back to it with fresh eyes and you're better off changing the fixes then. After continuing with the glazes, I think it's looking pretty good. You can see we pretty much smoothed that whole area out. If you look really closely, you could probably still see the banding, but I'm under 3 very, very bright lights now, and definitely under the tabletop you won't be able to see that blend. There's a few things I think need correcting, and one of them is this volume here. So it's just got a little narrow, and it looks like that should be a very deep fold, but if we look, it's reasonably flat. So this one's okay, and then that's okay because it's quite deep, and then on that side's fine, but I think I need to soften that. And it looks kind of cool, but this is just a critique, and I want to show you how you can fix things after. So I've actually mixed up some fresh paint on the palette, same process as before with the 2 blues, and I'm just going to kind of relayer them. So I've got the Canterbury blue with a tiny bit of Bering blue, and we're going to try and soften up this line. So I'm literally just relayering basically. And it might look worse for a bit where you you lose the blend, but it will look better in the end for sure. And you can kind of make any more corrections you need to do as you go. And you're mixing up this new thick paint. So to my eye that already looks nicer because it's just that little bit softer, and that kind of tells me that the Canterbury blue was probably a little bit too dark, and actually maybe that should be the maximum shadow. So in retrospect, maybe the Night Lord's blue was a waste of time and a little bit too dark, and that perhaps if I started again I would just base coat in the Canterbury blue, and that's actually dark enough. So yeah, just learning a little bit about these colours and the contrast, and it's nice to take your time and experiment on a hero like this. So when I roll out the troops, all the spearmen, I won't waste my time with certain steps, and I can just speed that up. So I still want to soften it a little more. It's more about broadening these highlights. They're just a bit too skinny. So I'm kind of just making them wider until I think it looks more natural. And this is one of the problems with glazing, is often you can adjust the volumes too much and things can get a little bit narrow and things like that, but it's all good. We'll get there in the end. Probably do with a bit more on here as well. So this is the final look for the blue. I feel like I could carry on blending and fiddling with this forever, but it looks pretty good, and I have to remember that this is for tabletop, so I just keep painting until I'm happy, which normally never happens, so paint for too long. But I'm happy about softening this. I think this looks nicer, and it's reasonably well blended, so yeah, pretty happy with that result. I think for this tutorial we'll finish by painting the trim, because that'll tidy the look up. You can see I've just got the blue everywhere, so I think, yeah, once we kind of painted all those areas, it'll look a lot nicer. I'm thinking about doing it in white, so the same colour as the armour, but I'm going to kind of cheat a bit and make it look almost like non-metallic metal silver. I don't want to do it non-metallic metal, obviously, because we have the true metallics, and that's what we're going to do on this figure. But I think I'll just do like a high contrast white, and maybe it'll turn out cool. So what I'm going to do is base coat everything in Vallejo dark grey. Any dark grey will do, and then we'll start the highlights from there. So we had to base coat in dark grey to make sure we had nice definition between the blue, and it already looks way better. I forgot to do that little symbol actually, so I'll need to do that in a bit. And then we're going to just take some neutral grey, and we're going to pretty much paint over the whole thing. But similar to the trim, we'll just paint the top I'm at the wrong angle here. So just tip of the brush, and then you can see you've got that dark grey either side. There's these little ring bits. I think they're going to be silver, true metallic silver. So I will paint those when I do the rest of the silver. And then the little tassels though, we can paint those. I think that looks really nice with the grey. We're going to take the Citadel, I can't remember what it's called, Administratum grey. I've never actually used this before. You can tell by how brand new the pot is, but it looks good. And now we're going to start the highlights, following the folds a bit more. So where we've got like a highlight here on the fold, I'm going to use the side of the brush because I've got easy access to these bits, and push the paint up a little bit like that. Make sure it's a little bit diluted, otherwise it won't matter your brush stroke direction. All of that bit, I think. This is pretty much, like I said, a silver non-metallic metal kind of recipe. And we'll push this contrast. And we'll see what it looks like. But I really like the grey actually. So I don't know if I'll push it to white. I quite like having the soft grey. And we'll finish with some Eltharion grey. Same deal, just bring it up into the middle. And then like catch a little bit there. Super simple and not a very exciting colour, but I think it's important to have some neutral colours because we have all this blue and gold going on. So just having that neutral and simple looks great, easy to paint, and yeah, quite pleased with that. I need to do all the little tassels, but that's quite tricky to do on film. I'm just trying to pick out those little hairs. But I need that close to my face to do a good job. I actually really liked it in the previous step when it felt more grey, so perhaps there's something in that for the rest of the scheme. When I paint the rest of them, I might in fact knock back some of these. So just kind of blend it in with the previous grey. I think it was nicer when it wasn't overpowering, just having a nice soft grey on there to support the other colours. So yeah, something in that. So last thing I'm going to do is pick out all the little, whatever they're called, rings, claspy bits. And I'm going to use just Elven Gold, and I reckon with the dark grey we base coat in, it might look okay. Just highlight it with this. I really like that. There's such a tiny amount, and because we have all the gold up here, kind of balances it out nicely. And to be honest, the metallic paint looks so good against the crazy matte cloth. It's really nice in hand, and I'm pretty excited to see what this looks like on the tabletop. I did it a little highlight with the light bronze, just adding a little bit, but yeah, that's pretty much it. So I think I might darken down some of the grey here. I did like it when it was a touch darker, maybe neutral grey, and a bit of the administratum as the highlight, but that's cool. I'm happy with that blue. I really enjoyed painting the cloak, and I'm excited to see what that looks like on the troops. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. I've covered cloaks before, but I wanted to be a bit more in depth and show you a lot of the process. It's just a question I get asked all the time about smooth blending, how to layer, all these little things. And don't forget, we have the video on the YouTube with the power sword, and that talks a lot about the layering, the glazing as well. So hopefully if you watch that and then watch this one too, you can do some better cloaks. And hopefully you can see that with a simple technique and putting in a lot of time, you can get a really nice result. I mean, I think this looks cool. I hope you do too. And I also have a tutorial doing some airbrushing on cloaks. So covering airbrushing cloaks and painting them with just a brush like we did today. Hopefully this is something we've helped you tackle. In the next tutorial, I'm going to cover the rest of the details really. So I really wanted to give this this cloak its own video because it was more about painting cloaks in general rather than Eltharion. But in the next video, it will be pretty much about finishing Eltharion's details. They're all quite simple in comparison, but I'll do a nice step-by-step for gems. And then we've got the sort of the scale mail. That'll be quite easy. I haven't decided what to do with the swords yet, whether to do them silver metallic with some kind of effect in the detail there, or to do them like a power weapon style with some blending. And then of course we'll do the base, and I'll probably do that as a separate video, basing Lumineth, and we'll try and come up with something cool for that. But yeah, hope you enjoyed this one. As always, give us some feedback. Let us know what you think of the result and what you think of the technique, and if it's going to help you at all. And looking forward to seeing what you do with this tutorial. See you on the next one.